Many of the listeners will, I hope, have had a good lunch today. Perhaps they have partaken of ice cream as part of their pudding. And it's that food that has an intimate connection with the subject of my talk this time. It's about the Italian community of Belfast in particular and Northern Ireland generally. Nowadays, there are not as many Italian ice cream parlours and fish and chip saloons as in the past. But where the community hailed from in Italy and why it settled here is a fascinating story. That beautiful part of Italy south of Rome and on the road to Naples and known as the Valle di Camino in the Abruzzi Mountains, not far from Monte Cassino, is where the vast majority of these folk originated, from the province of Fosdenone and the villages of Casalatico and Montale, now Monforte especially. In the middle of the 19th century, that part of Italy, like many other places in Europe, suffered extreme poverty, and for many of the young men, emigration was their only hope of betterment. The unsettled political state of the country before unification added to its problems. This was the era of Garibaldi, and much disruption occurred. The young men went, often on foot, to adjacent countries, made some money and returned to their native soil. But many had wider ambitions and strove to reach the British Isles and even America. The community in Ireland, and a large number eventually settled in Belfast, dates from the 1860s. They came chiefly in dribs and drabs, as the saying goes, and were hard-working in their attempts to attain betterment. Initially, many of the Italians settled in Belfast near the docks, having arrived via Derry or Scotland. The community grew, and that part of the town became known as Little Italy. Today, Little Italy has gone, having been swallowed up by car parks and feeder roads to the M2 and M5 motorways. But in the past, it comprised roughly that part of York Street northwards from Great Patrick Street down to more or less the old Great George's Street, with the streets in between to Corporation Street. Frederick Street, too, had a number of Italian families. In the baptismal registers of St. Patrick's Catholic Church, Donegal Street, covering the period at the turn of the 20th century and later, are contained many Italian names, such as Forte, Fosco, Santini, Marcella, Forgione, Morelli, De Luca, Valenti, Rossi, Panisi, and Trigonetta. In the registers, it is assumed that there are some misspellings, as the clergy of the day would not always have been familiar with the names. In the 1908 Belfast Street Directory, their occupations in the streets of Little Italy are given variously as artists, musicians, terrazzo workers, and ice cream salesmen. The making of ice cream, a native Italian dish, became a speciality with many of these folk. And in the past, on the main roads out of the city, their parlours with names like Fosco and Forte, Raffo, D'Agostino and Foscardi were very much in evidence. Very often the owner of the shop and his family lived above the place, which could be rented fairly cheaply. With the ice cream, which was invariably made by family recipe, manufactured at the back of the premises. The growing and perhaps extended family of the shop owner would all have been expected to take turns at serving in it, at weekends, especially on Sunday afternoons, the sight of an Italian vendor on a bicycle, fitted with a large tub to the front, filled with ice cream, would have been a familiar sight in my young days around the streets. A sort of klaxon horn contraption sounded his arrival at a particular location. In an earlier generation, the Monkey Man, an Italian with a barrel organ, was well known in the city. He was called Giacomo. A monkey dressed in a little suit collected the money. The Belfast Co-op in York Street was a favourite place for him. Recently, I had the home manufacturing process explained to me by an elderly Italian. It involved milk, butter, cream, sugar, and blocks of ice mixed in vessels and churns, and was not made unlike the way my own family used to make butter during World War II and after, a most tedious process, I remember. When I was passing from childhood into my teens, I recall that several of the vendors had acquired small motor vehicles which went from door to door. Seeing one always excited me. The particular colourful designs of the motor cars seemed to have a special attraction. Incidentally, terrazzo involved working with a mixture of marble and cement to lay floors. The first fish and chip shop in Belfast was created around about 1900. It was Italian owned, and it was, I understand, in York Street. Apparently the eating of chips, as we know it, Walter, dates from about 1870 and was introduced to Ireland by Italians. Before that, roasted chestnuts were popular. But one cold night, the story goes, a seller of chestnuts cut and roasted a potato in pieces which he sold to a customer, and so the practice of eating roasted or chipped potatoes began. At a later date, fried fish were added, and the habit of a relatively cheap way of consuming food began. In Ireland, the dish caught on due to the availability of potatoes, which were reasonably inexpensive. In later times, a so-called fish supper, meaning a portion of fish and chips, was and still is popular. Earlier, this was called in some quarters a 1-and-1. Pasta, too, is now a popular food here. The Italians dominated this trade and also the selling of catering equipment. Cafes and restaurants sprang up. Well-known names of these included the Continental in Castle Street in Belfast, run by the Fortes, where one could always obtain a light meal all day and late into the evening. This was especially welcome on Sundays, when many so-called other eating houses were closed. Another popular spot was the attractive Mistletoe Cafe in High Street. In the 1950s, and just facing the Mistletoe, was the Albert. I remember going always to this cafe, as one could obtain a far bigger slider of ice cream there as compared to the Mistletoe for half the price. That is, 3 pennies worth as opposed to 6 pennies. Other features of many of the Italian ice cream shops were the coloured lights and the snugs or boxes inside, where one could have privacy in sitting down to a fruit ice. Many stories are told of the hardship which the early immigrants suffered in reaching their ultimate destinations in Northern Ireland. One story I have of the early days concerns a large group of Italians who boarded a ship in Italy and paid their passages to the United States. The master of the ship was dishonest and berthed his vessel in Glasgow and refused to proceed further. The passengers disembarked, Some stayed in Scotland and set up in the catering business there, and some came on by different vessels to Belfast and Derry and stayed in those cities. In the first half of the 20th century, certainly prior to the Second War, many young Italian males returned to their native villages and married local girls and brought them home to Belfast, or else they married into other Italian families residing in Northern Ireland. Today this tradition is not so prevalent, and there is much intermarriage between Italians and the outside community. I have been reading a history of the Italians in Ireland written by Una Power in 1988, published by the Leinster Times of Carlow and called Terra Straniera. It makes for fascinating reading and traces their origins in the homeland right up to modern times. There are many facets of Italian customs which are of interest. Apparently it was the custom, certainly in the past, for a suitor for a bride's hand to ask her father 3 times for permission to marry. If the father gave the daughter away at the first asking, it was considered that her folk were anxious to get rid of her. Also in the old days, many marriages were arranged. It must not have been easy, Walter, for the early settlers coming to Northern Ireland, in the sense that there was a language barrier with the indigenous population. But in time they integrated well and were and are popular here. Within their own families and their community generally, the speaking of the native language was very much the done thing. Some Italians today in Northern Ireland say that this is sadly no longer as prevalent. The promotion of the Italian language and customs in the local community was very much encouraged then. It was largely due to the efforts of the Italians in Northern Ireland that a Department of Italian was set up in the early 60s at Queen's University. I remember too in the 60s when for a number of years the Italian government helped to subsidise a season of opera with native singers every year at the Opera House in Belfast. In these now far-off youthful days, I recall attending the season every night for a week and thrilling to the delights of hearing singers like the young Pavarotti, Giuseppe Forgione, Plinto Calbasi and others. I sat in the gods where seats cost, if I remember correctly, 3 and 6 and 5 shillings. One could not relate the history of the Italians in Belfast without mentioning Felice Piccioni, who settled in Belfast in the 1840s. Piccioni was an artist, and previous to Belfast he had lived in Cork. Today in the city he is chiefly remembered for painting the large altarpiece in St Malachy's Church in Alfred Street. Other large paintings by him can be seen at each side of the sanctuary in St Mary's in Chapel Lane, though he was mainly a charcoal artist on a small scale, some of whose work can be seen in the Ulster Museum. The St Malachy's altarpiece is easily the largest of his canvases. Piccioni lived at 71 Corporation Street, and his studio was in Hammond's Court, near to the present-day Castle Lane in the city centre. It is believed that he went to spend his retirement with his family in South Africa. The magnificent stucco work, which is reflected in the ceiling of St Malachy's Church, was executed by Italian craftsmen, as an example of the high standard achieved by these folk in the middle of the 19th century. The grand houses still left in Dublin abound with these folks' work too. A very early Italian resident in Belfast was the excitable Signor Gaetano Fabrini, who in 1816 was a drawing master at Belfast Inst. During the Second World War, those Italians who had retained native citizenship residing in Northern Ireland were interned. At that time, Italy had come into the war on the side of Germany. The internees were taken mostly to the Isle of Man, where they were kept for the duration of hostilities. A man from Belfast, Patrick Marcella, remembered and related in Terra Straniera how a friendly policeman had tipped off his family in Belfast that internment was about to happen. Marcella saw the names of a number of Italians that he knew on the intended list. When the policeman left the house, Patrick went to a number of them, telling of what was about to happen. But none of them believed him, and as a result were subsequently rounded up and deported. If they had heeded him, they could have gone south to the Irish Free State, and so avoided this very unpleasant experience, with the resultant distress it caused their families. A Mr. Morelli from Portrush, whose story was told on BBC television some time ago, suffered this fate. Not all these folk escaped with their lives, for a number of them, along with kindred spirits from England and Germans, were interned on the prisoner of war ship Andorra Star. The Andorra Star left Liverpool early in the morning of July the 1st, 1940. But in the morning of the next day, it was sunk by a German U-boat. Many hundreds perished in this disaster, and of the survivors, approximately 200 were eventually sent to Australia, where they spent the rest of the war in a camp. It is fair to say, Walter, that the sinking of this ship was controversial, and some people do not believe the official version of what happened. Earlier in the 1920s and 30s, and encouraged by Mussolini, an Italian Sunday school for the young existed in Donegal Street in Belfast. This was to strengthen the link with the mother country and retain the language and customs. In the 1950s, and for a number of years, I remember a religious mission for Italians conducted for a number of days each year in St. Mary's Catholic Church in Belfast. After each service, it was remarkable to see all of the congregation gathering in the street outside the building. The colourful occasion and the dress of the people and the chat reminded one very much of a village square back in Italy. In 1956, Vincent Forte of Belfast was elected Mayor of Castellatico while still living in Belfast. It must be remembered that Vincent, like many Italians then and still do, make at least one visit to their homeland each year. Vincent had started his Belfast catering business in 1912 and quickly became a respected figure in the Italian and Irish communities. Like many of his fellow expats, he was shocked to witness the suffering of his people back home after the German collaboration, and how the hillside people there needed the urgent necessities of life like medical supplies, food and clothes. During this time, it is recalled that many of the villagers in places like Castellatico were treated particularly roughly by German soldiers on account of having so many Ulster-type mementos in their homes and letters and stamps from here. Vincent was the president of a committee which was formed, and from 1945 for a year, a total of 20 tons of clothes and medical supplies were sent to the homeland. Later in 1946, he visited the afflicted area and saw the lack of educational facilities available. Again, he raised enough money to buy desks, benches and school equipment. Eventually, he was awarded the L'Ordine della Stella, which in art terms is a sort of knighthood by the Italian government for his humanitarian efforts. In 1951, there was a great flood in Italy, and again the Italians of Belfast and elsewhere in Ireland rallied to the efforts of fundraising to provide relief. One event was the premiere of the film The Blue Veil, starring Charles Laughton and Jane Wyman, the first wife of former United States President Ronald Reagan. With regards to numbers, the 1871 census returns indicate that there were then only 18 Italians in Belfast, 13 males and 5 female. 10 years later, there were 28, of which 22 were males. In 1891, there were 41, which included 17 females, and by 1901, 70, 51 males included. However, these figures referred only to those born in Italy. So if we count children born locally, the community numbers were higher. For a number of years, the Irish News printed a weekly column written in Italian for them. Post-World War I saw quite a rise in numbers. By 1960, the community in Northern Ireland numbered approximately 200. For many years, there has been a cultural circle here called Associato Italiano Irlandi del Nord, which runs functions. Another more recent group is the Dante Alighieri Society. The troubles from 1969 caused quite a number to leave the province and go south or further afield. Thus the social cohesion of the community was weakened. Incidentally, Lord Forte, the famous hotelier from London, had Northern Ireland family connections. And Frank Carson, the Belfast comic, his mother was Italian. At present, there are approximately 400 people registered as Italians here, with the consul in Belfast, and a further 1,500 who can claim some ethnic connection. In the last European elections, they had their own polling station set up in the Hilton Hotel, where they were able to vote for candidates back home in their local regions. A lot of the names of families I listed earlier are still here, as well as those like Cafola, Rizza, Milai and Traversari. Some years ago, there resided in the city a Dominic Traversari, who was a gifted statue painter and had his own statuette works. I knew him and his family well. Nowadays, Italian restaurants have replaced the earlier and more humble ice cream parlours and fish and chip shops. But thankfully, there are still a few of the latter around in various places in the province. Today's Italians have diversified career-wise and are to be found as members of all trades and professions. Many years ago, an elderly clergyman who had a great love of Italian architecture, music and the language, whispered to me one day that all things considered, that he felt God to be an Italian. I can see what he meant, considering the land itself and its art and music. All that remains, Walter, is for both of us now to go out and look for an old-fashioned Italian ice cream parlour. I think I know of a very good one, still existing near enough the studio. Would you like a sixpenny slider?
Best offer I've had all day. That was Jim O'Hagan. And to end today, a famous Italian who performed to packed houses in Belfast many years ago, Beniamino Gigli.
L'aurora di bianco vestita, e giallo sciò dischiuda il gran sol, vedigia con le rose spedita, carezzava i fiori lo suo, e con me se l'anfrenita mettiare che tu l'oveste bianca e schiudi l'uscio alla tua carta. Ove non sei alla luce marca, ove tu sei e nasce l'amor. Mettiare che tu l'oveste bianca e schiudi l'uscio alla tua carta. Ove non la sei alla luce marca, ove tu sei nasce l'amor.
92 to 95 FM.
and 1341 medium wave.
BBC Radio Ulster.